Hello everyone and welcome to American Civil War and UK History channel on Facebook, YouTube and Instagram. So today we've got a guest, James Evans, who has come to talk to us about his ancestors who fought in the American Civil War. So from what I understand, you have 4 great-great-grandfathers and 2 great-grandfathers that fought in the Civil War. So James, please tell us a little bit about yourself and a bit about the research that you did on your great-grandfathers.
Okay, well, I'm born and raised here, right here in Missouri, Southwest Missouri. I'm the youngest of 7 children, and my parents, when I was born, they were older, but I count myself fortunate because of that. They told me a lot of things that a lot of people my age didn't know, and they had known. Well, one of them had actually, my mom had known my great-grandfather, Theodore, for a while before he ever passed away. He was like 90 when he passed, so she kind of knew him. But she really knew more about my grandpa Jungan, her grandfather, Thomas Junkins. And I learned a lot. That was where it really got started with me. She sparked it in me. She was always telling me stories about him as a kid. And I've grew up here. This is my home. I live in the house that I grew up in, and I'm just pretty much a simple country boy. I've grew up out here. As far as research goes, I've always been somebody that's curious, and I did a lot of reading and stuff on my family, going back and looking at pictures and things like that, and asking my mom stuff. So fortunately, she lived to be 94 years old. She passed away about 5 years ago. And she was sharp. She was smart and sharp as a tack up until she died. She was fortunate in that she didn't have any of the, problems a lot of older people had. It amazed her doctors even. And that's pretty much it. I mean,
brilliant, mate. That's a really good, nice story. Also growing up where you did, I suppose, with the ancestors you had, talking about the Civil War, it was always a topic, was it? Was they always talking about what your granddads did and stuff like that?
Yeah. And my mom, she especially talked about her grandfather. He was her grandfather. He's my great-grandfather. She always talked about him, Thomas Junkins. And he was born in Maine and came here. He came to Kansas first and settled. And then later on, my sister and I, she's very interested in genealogy, and so am I. And we started doing a lot of digging and finding out things. And I've always been fascinated with their Civil War history.
That's
my
cool.
sister does a lot of other stuff, but I got into that, and I started digging through and finding all kinds of things and all kinds of resources. And I have family members who are genealogists and everything else, and they've helped out too with a lot of things.
Oh, that's really cool. So we're going to talk about the first one. So I'm going to put up a screen, so hopefully people can see this. So hang on, we started on the wrong one. Do apologise. Oh, technical issue. There we go. So the first guy we have is Robert Louis Tadlock. So please tell us a little bit about Robert.
He's my great-great-grandfather on my dad's side. He was my grandmother's grandfather. He was in the Illinois 60th. He actually was only in for 7 months. It's kind of sad because he wanted to serve. I believe that he really wanted to serve, and from his writings after the war, he told, he was a good soldier. But what happened to him was he came down with a case of typhoid, and it nearly killed him, and he lost partial sight in one eye. They sent him back home, and he went back, and to recover from that typhoid, he went back, and they discovered that he couldn't go for service. He was also the oldest one of them. He was like 40 years old when he joined. So they disabled him out, but he was always very proud of his service. And if you see on there, he's got this, looks like a medal on or a badge. That's a Grand Army of the Republic badge, because he was a member of that for many years. And his son, my great-grandfather, Logan Tadlock, was named after a general from that area of Illinois where he was from, John Logan.
So
and he came here to Missouri sometime in the 1870s.
So did he volunteer to go into service?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, he did.
So
he was very strong on that. And I think one of the reasons that he volunteered and one of the reasons he was so disappointed when he had to be disabled out is his mother was Native American. And so he had experienced prejudice. And I think that was part of his motivation.
That's an amazing story. Amazing. Must be so proud of these guys.
Oh, I am. And that picture there of his tombstone where he's buried is just about, probably about 3 miles from where I live.
Okay. So do you go and visit it sometimes?
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
That's cool.
Yeah, I go visit him a lot.
So after the war, he settled back in Missouri, did he?
Yeah, he came to Missouri sometime in the 1870s. And that he settled just probably about a few miles from where I live.
Okay. That's really cool. So, okay, let's move on to the next guy. I know this guy is Thomas Jefferson Junkins, and you can see here you've got his enlistment paper as well, and this is a photo of the guy, obviously after the war. So, tell us a little bit about this guy.
He was quite a character. He was he went to Kansas, and to give his story, he went to Kansas in 1858. He was 20 years old. He was born and raised in Maine. He was part of, and I think he was an abolitionist. That was a hotbed of abolitionism up there in the, up in the Northeast in New England. And a lot of settlers went to Kansas to keep it a free state. His two older brothers had already moved out there, but he went primarily after they did. His father, his father had remarried, and his stepmother was kind of the evil stepmother. And so in a way to get away from her and to join his brothers out there and to keep Kansas a free state, he did. He went out there and he stayed. And then in 1862, he joined the Kansas 12th Volunteer Infantry, and he was a very good shot. And so he was trained to be a sharpshooter and a sniper. And he dealt particularly along the Missouri and Kansas borders a lot with being a sharpshooter and a sniper. And I know that I've run across several different things that show that where he most likely took out several guerrilla leaders along that border, or guerrilla fighters at least. And then he was at the occupation of Kansas City, and eventually he was sent back down to Fort Scott, Kansas, and he guarded trains going from Fort Scott to Fort Smith in Arkansas. And when they did that, they either had to ride in an open car or up on top of the box cars with a rifle ready to stop anybody from trying to attack those trains. And it was kind of dangerous because it went through the Indian Territory. And there were Stanwaddy, and his General Stanwaddy had a bunch of troops there. So it was kind of a dangerous situation. Then later, he wound up in the Camden expedition, which was in Arkansas. And he wound up fighting at Prairie du Chien and also at the Battle of Jenkins Ferry at some point during that campaign. And I often wonder if it wasn't because that happened during that campaign as well. The massacre at Poison Springs, he found a black man who had been, as a black soldier, had been bayoneted in the stomach, and his intestines were hanging out. My grandfather found him, and he grabbed his sewing kit, started pushing the guy's insides back in and sewing him up without any anesthesia or painkillers whatsoever. And after that, he didn't know if that man lived or died. And a few years later in Kansas, he's standing on the street corner. A guy comes running out of the crowd, a black guy, runs up to him, grabs him and starts hugging him. And then he realizes who it was. It was the guy that he had saved his life.
Oh, wow. What an amazing story.
Yeah.
Absolutely
and
amazing.
He also fought at the Battle of Jenkins Ferry. That was really, I think, the last really big battle he was in. And a lot of people don't know about that battle, but actually, if you've ever seen the movie Lincoln, it's the first battle in that they show in the opening of Lincoln. Was at the Battle of Jenkins Ferry, where the Kansas First, and he fought side by side with them. The Kansas First, which was a colored regiment, he fought right with them at times, and he was a sharpshooter. He's also believed to have taken out a couple of high-ranking Confederates down there in Arkansas too, because he was a sniper. That was his job. A lot of people don't like that idea, but he was under orders, and he was the example of a good man who had to do bad things. That was what
I get the perception that sharpshooters at the time got a bit of a bad sort of, because it wasn't chivalrous, it wasn't gentlemanly, was it? Do you know what I mean?
No. Yeah, it wasn't, but in a lot of ways they were under orders to have to do that, and it's either do that or whatever. During that Camden expedition, and I'll talk about that a little bit later on too, about my other great grandfather. He nearly starved to death, and they all nearly did. And when they got to Jenkins Ferry, they were actually headed back to Little Rock to resupply and the Confederates caught them there. And that was a brutal battle in a river swamp. They were fighting in water anywhere from 6 inches to knee deep, and maybe even deeper than that because it was flooding at that time.
So what regiment was this guy in, sorry?
The Kansas 12th Volunteer Infantry, okay. Company B.
So that was a Union one, was it?
Yes, it was Union. All of my grandfathers were Union.
Sorry. Yeah, sorry about that. Yeah, it's just that obviously Kansas was a border state, wasn't it? So
yeah, it was. And
no, not Kansas. Sorry, I'm thinking of
Missouri was.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, getting confused. But yeah, so any beginning? So what actual army was his regiment in?
At that point, it would have been the Army of the Frontier. I'm not exactly sure. I would have to look.
That's cool. Okay, so I'm going to move on to the next guy. So we have got. Oh, sorry. This is just a family. I want to talk about this one first. So this is your Thomas Junkins with his family. So tell us a little bit about this.
That's him, and then my great-great-grandmother Catherine Elizabeth Evans Junkins, and her maiden name was Evans, but her family was no relation to my dad's family. They were a different group of Evanses altogether. And the girl there is her youngest daughter, my Aunt Bertha, or Aunt Bert as they called her. And she was the youngest of 11 children. My grandmother was Martha Washington Junkins, and they called her Mattie. That was my grandmother. She was like their 9th child, I think.
Okay, cool. So we have Alexander Hicks. So please tell us about this guy.
Okay, Alexander Selkirk Hicks. Well, he was actually born in North Carolina, but his family moved to Indiana at some point. When he was about 20 years old, he joined the Indiana 58th Volunteer Infantry. And he wound up just a few months after he joined, he was at Stones River during that battle. And he was in Company A, which was part of Haskell's brigade. And he wound up fighting right there in what they call Hell's Half Acre or Round Forest. And where he was stationed during that, where his company was at, was near a corn crib owned by some people by the name of Gerald. And they had to lay flat on the ground in order to keep from getting hit, because that area was drawing so much fire, they had to shoot from the prone position. Fortunately, he survived that battle. And it's amazing that he did. And then he went on to fight through what they call the Tullahoma campaign, which does not get a lot of attention, but it actually was a very important situation, which kind of pushed Braxton Bragg back down into the corner of Tennessee and pretty much broke the Confederacy's hold on Tennessee. They pushed him, and then after that, the Battle of Chickamauga, he was there. And then he was underneath the siege of Chattanooga. He was there, and also the battles of Chattanooga and Lookout Mountain. Then he went on to participate in the Atlanta campaign. And he also, and a lot of people are not going to like this when I say it, particularly down south, he actually helped burn Atlanta. He was part of that army that helped burn the city of Atlanta because he was an engineer, and they had to dismantle a lot of the stuff before the factories and stuff, before they burned them, so that they couldn't ever be used again. And they also dismantled the roundhouse. And one of the things was, when they dismantled that roundhouse where the railroad trains turned around in, the Confederates had stored some ammo in there that caught on fire, and that helped set off a lot more fires because it started explosions and going all over the place. And then he participated in the March to the Sea. He was basically an engineer through much of the war. He laid down a lot of the roads and bridges on the way to Savannah from Atlanta. In fact, he helped rebuild a bridge called the King's Bridge. There's a bridge there to this day in Georgia. Of course, the old bridge, the bridge that he helped rebuild, is gone now. But that bridge, there's a marker there where they rebuilt that bridge. And it was about 1,000 feet long, that bridge was. That's how long it was. And they built it in only 6 days, which is amazing. And it was a regular bridge, not a pontoon bridge either. And at the same time, they constructed a wharf for seagoing vessels to come up that river, the Ogeechee River, there in Georgia. They could come up from the sea, and they built a wharf there so they could resupply from there sometimes. And after they captured Savannah, then eventually the campaign through the Carolinas, and he did the same thing all the way through South Carolina and North Carolina. When they got to North Carolina, by that time, the war was pretty much over. Lee surrendered to Grant, and they were going to actually send them by boat to Washington to participate in the Grand Review. And General Sherman decided, no, he didn't want his men to get, I guess, seasick or something. He decided to have them march, and they did. They marched all the way through from North Carolina through Virginia to Washington, D.C. And they marched he marched in the Grand Review in front of the president and everybody. The funny thing about that is the Western troops, and this goes to the Western Theater and how they were, they got brand new uniforms for them to march in. They all almost unanimously voted they weren't going to do that. They were going to wear their old uniforms just to show them they were this was what the Western Theater, the guys out of the West, were like. They were the farmers, they were the hardworking men that worked the land, and they decided they wanted to show that side of themselves. They didn't want the fancy dressed up, I guess, finery of the day. So I think that's kind of neat and kind of makes me laugh when I think about it. And so that's how they marched through the Grand Review on that day. And he actually was discharged in Washington, D.C.
Okay. That's amazing. Yeah. So they obviously liked their tatty uniforms, I suppose. They probably got attached to them, didn't they?
Yeah.
That's so good. Anyway, so let's move on, James. That's Alexander. So now we have Henry Foster Evans. And this is a sketch, is it? This isn't a photo, is it? This is a sketch.
It's something like that. It's a painting of him. It's so old. I mean, I wish I had a better picture of him than I do, but that's it. That's what we've got. He wasn't very big. He was actually a fairly small guy. He was only 5'6", 5'7". He had and this is when he was older. So he had one blue eye, one brown eye. He had kind of reddish color hair and beard. And he was quite a young man. He was from Missouri. He was the only one of my great-grandfathers or great-great-grandfathers to be born in Missouri. He was born here in 1837. His parents had come. His father came from North Carolina. His mother came from Illinois. And he was also, other than Robert Louis Tadlock, he was the only other one married during that war. He was 19 when he got married, and that was in 1856, I think, several years before the war. He was 19, she was 17, Lavina, his wife. When he joined the Missouri 24th Volunteer Infantry, which was a Union regiment, he wound up, he had to leave her and 3 little children behind when he went off to war. And I've always said this, I'm sure he left her with a gun to make sure she could protect herself, and she knew how to use it, because at that time, Missouri was tearing itself apart inside. It was a civil war, as I like to put it, a civil war inside of a civil war, because there were a lot of, not necessarily Confederate regulars, but the guerrilla fighters would come in and they would harass Union families. And sometimes you were hopeful that maybe the Union Home Guard or the Missouri Enrolled Militia would show up and stop it, but you didn't know. And so she was a very tough young lady as well. He fought at the battles of Pea Ridge. He was there under his commanding officer actually was my cousin, the 6th cousin of mine through my mother's side, Samuel Curtis. He fought there, and one of the things was they had to take a hill there at Pea Ridge, and they took that hill along with members of an Iowa regiment and some cavalry. They drove the Confederates off that hill. They took it, and then they held it the rest of the day until they were relieved for that night. And then the next day, I don't know very much about it, because at that point, most of that next day was a lot of artillery fighting, artillery fire and everything else, which wound up, of course, the Union won that. Later, they went from Pea Ridge to West Plains, Missouri, which is farther east. And from there, they went down into Arkansas, towards Helena, Arkansas, because General Curtis had thought to attack, and he was with the Army of the Southwest, or Army of Southwest Missouri. At that time, that was what it was called. I think later it became the Army of the Frontier. He went down, I want to say they marched into Helena and captured it. Before they got there, they wound up meeting the Confederates at a place called Cotton Plant. They defeated them there, and then they marched to Helena. And at Helena was where he nearly died the first time. And it wasn't from bullets. It was because when they marched from Cotton Plant to Helena, they were following wagons. And the wagons were kicking up so much dust, because it was in the middle of summer and it was dry. They breathed in, a lot of them breathed in so much of that dust that they got what we would call dust pneumonia or farmer's pneumonia. And he nearly died of that. And they almost disabled him out, but he wouldn't let them for some reason. He was adamant that he was going to stay in there. He later served at Vicksburg. He participated in the burning of Jackson, Mississippi. And then he went on afterwards, he was sent to Chattanooga to help open up what they call the Cracker Line, because he was an engineer. He helped open that up, which got food and supplies into the troops in Chattanooga that were under siege. He went mainly, they fixed railroad lines and telegraph wires. Then after that, he was wound up in Arkansas in the Camden expedition with my other great-grandfather, Thomas Junkins, and Thomas actually wound up guarding him because he was an engineer doing that pontoon work. You had to have somebody stand there with a gun and watch you and protect you from him. And so he was in a way responsible for rescuing 2 of them. Alexander, he got help open up the supply line because Alexander was trapped in Chattanooga during the siege. And at Jenkins Ferry, he put down the pontoon bridge that Thomas and the others got across and got away from the Confederates after the Battle of Jenkins Ferry, because they were afraid they were going to come back there and attack them again. And it would probably have been a massacre. Then a little bit later than that, he nearly died again at Tupelo, Mississippi. During the battle, he fell with heat stroke, or sunstroke, as they called it back then. and he nearly died there. That was only about 3 months before he was to be discharged anyway. But he stayed in. He told him he wasn't going to leave. He was going to stay. They eventually were all sent. The Missouri 24th was sent to occupy the city of Little Rock, Arkansas. And there he stayed until he returned, until he was mustered out in October of 1864. And he had mustered in and joined in October of 1861. He was actually the first one of them to join up and volunteer.
Cool. Really cool story again. So did they actually physically know each other at this time, these three guys?
Thomas and Henry knew each other. Alexander, he never did meet him, I don't think, until he might have met him later on after the war, but I don't know if they ever met.
Okay. So, and we also have this guy. So we have Theodore Franklin Dungan. Did I say that correct? Dungan, sorry. Yeah.
Dungan.
Tell us about this guy.
Well, he was born in McMinn County, Tennessee, came here when he was 4 years old. His parents came here, and they were of Irish descent. He was a descendant of some of the first Irish settlers in North America, in the United States, in fact. And but he was only about 18 years old when he joined up. He was one of the younger ones. He joined the Missouri 74th and 73rd enrolled militias, which were basically, he was a mounted infantryman too, which meant they were sort of like a reserve force or the National Guard here in the United States. They were called on when there was an emergency or when there was trouble breaking out. And so a lot of times that was why they were mounted. They had to have horses to get from place to place quick enough. And in this area around here, there were no fences. Missouri was pretty much open range at that time. There were very few, if any, fences, and what fences there were rail fences. They could take them down, go through them, and ride on if they did that. Probably the biggest battle he was in a lot of little skirmishes. And I will say this, some people say, oh, well, skirmish, that's not that bad. Okay, it's kind of like an F-0 or an F1 tornado. It's like, yeah, it's not that bad unless it's right over you. You're right under it. And the same thing with skirmish. It's not bad unless you're in the middle of it, and people are shooting at you, trying to kill you. So he wound up having to go into the Battle of Springfield, Missouri, the second battle. There were two battles. The first one really was not that much back in 1861, a little bit after the Battle of Wilson's Creek. And he wound up, and I want to say they called him out that the day before. They sent out a call to every enrolled militia because they saw a Confederate force moving up out of Arkansas towards Springfield. And the reason they tried to capture Springfield, Missouri, is it was a major supply depot for the Union and a major medical center for them. And so just about every county sent in enrolled militia to back up the Union troops because there were only 1,300, and they thought they were going to be facing, a force of about 6,000. Well, it actually turned out to be only 2,000, but still there were only 1,300 Union troops in Springfield. And so without the help of the enrolled militias at the Battle of Springfield, which the Union won, they probably would have been taken by the Confederates. But that was mainly the main thing that I think he did. He was always kind of close to home in the enrolled militia, but still he did his service and did his duty, is what I was said about.
Okay, cool. So the last guy we have is Julius Seth Coburn. Did I say that correct?
Yeah.
Yeah. So
yeah, Coburn.
This guy.
Julius Seth Coburn. He was the only one drafted that I know of. He was the only one to be drafted. He was born in Ohio and had moved to Illinois as a young man. And he was drafted right towards the end of the war in November of 1864. So the war would end in just a few months, but it was also probably the bloodiest part of it. he wound up in Alabama, and he wound up. He fought at the battles of Fort Blakely and Spanish Fort, and he fought Spanish Fort. When they assaulted it, they did it at night under the light of the moon. I don't know as much about his service as some of the others. I've been doing a little more research, digging into it, but those were the only two battles I know that he was ever in. And then afterwards, and in fact, the funny thing of it is, I think it's Spanish Fort or Fort Blakely won. After that battle, they had fought that battle about 2 hours after Lee had surrendered to Grant, and the war had pretty much basically ended as far as that was concerned. So it's kind of, but back then they didn't have the communications we do today where they can just, instantaneously, get information. So they had to wait for a few days before they found out, but anyways, Mobile had surrendered to them, and later on, he was discharged because of a telegram from the War Department regarding drafted men. And I guess they probably just decided they didn't need him anymore. I still haven't got a whole lot of information on that. I just keep digging to find it.
Yeah, that's cool. That's really cool, though. I mean, do you think he was, because a lot of people were against being conscripted, wasn't they, at some places? I mean, some people were up for it, some people wasn't, Do you know whether he was, whether he really wanted to go in, or what, do you know?
I don't know. I honestly don't. I honestly don't. His father had fought, his father's, not his father, but his grandfather had fought in the War of 1812, Samuel Coburn. And before that, I think it was like his great-great-grandfather, or his great-grandfather, Richard Coburn, had fought in the Revolutionary War. And so
yeah,
we know that they had
a
long line of service.
War, sorry. It brings back bad memories,
Brings back bad memories, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Or as you guys like to refer to it, the American insurrection.
Yeah, that's the one. Those colonists chucking all that tea in the sea. How dare they? Anyway, no. But yeah, so that's really cool, mate. Anyway, so that's the last guy. So yeah, it's lovely talking to you, mate. I mean, you've got some great, you've done a lot of work there to find out all this information. It's great, that you've taken the time to do that. I mean, it must be amazing to find out all these, and it must have been great finding out all these stories over the time, of these people.
Yeah.
It must have been enjoyable to research and look into, so.
Oh, it is. It's, I always tell people, don't just use one source. There are so many sources out there that we have. A lot of people around here in this country tend to use ancestry.com. But unfortunately, I have found out a lot of information on Ancestry is wrong when it comes to looking at people's family trees and stuff. They may have put in the wrong things there, because I've found mistakes in my own family tree and have tried to correct them, and it's like pulling teeth to get it corrected. I have one thing I will say: if you're looking for like Civil War information, the first best place to go, if you know the regiment they were in, go to the National Park Service's Soldiers and Sailors database, and you can put in there, you can put in their name, and maybe you can put in whatever state they were in, and hopefully you can find something there. Another one is, another thing, if you do know the regiment, pretty much where they fought and stuff. Another thing is, and it was a volume, it's like 30 volume set, but you can access it through a lot of different universities here in the US. It's called The War of the Rebellion. It's like a 30 volume encyclopedia. And if you know what time they served, where they served, and all that, you can find out a lot of information through that. Okay,
cool. Anyway, James, I really, really appreciate you coming to talk to everyone today. And they're really going to enjoy this because it's amazing and amazing stories. So anyway, thank you for coming on. And we'll talk again soon. Thank you very much.
Hopefully.